In the darkest corners of history, where bodies were governed by fear and superstition was applied to science, medieval sexuality was a struggle between desire and repression. It wasn't just an era of old lore or strange rituals. It was a time in which intimacy wasn't intimate, and the most intimate human moments were warped by fear, ignorance, and untrammeled power. Enter a world in which a wedding night was not about love. It was a trial in front of everyone. Picture yourself at 14, not in some nice moment, but with neighbors who wanted physical proof of your virginity. Envision a world in which women believed that a woman's womb was a wandering beast inside her, where women believed that menstrual blood was poisonous, where even a mised sexual position was feared to usher in the demon's forces into your bed. These weren't fringe myths whispered in the dark. These ideas were adopted by priests, legislators, and physicians. They codified laws, prescribed relations, and made the bedroom a battleground for shame and social intimidation. Between the 5th and the 15th century, the medieval world was contradictory. As cathedrals soared toward the heavens, sexuality was drawn into the shadows. The church dominated everything, thoughts, bodies, even pleasure itself. It did not just manage what people thought. It governed how they could touch, love, and be. But even under such a repressive atmosphere, human passion lingered. It whispered through clandestine remedies, hidden folk rituals, and furtive seconds of defiance. It's more than a tale of strange old laws. It's a glimpse into the way power can warp the most personal elements of human life. It's a story of how shame becomes law, myths become truth, and humans long for intimacy even in repressive circumstances. Aristocrat or commoner, they all shared the weight of this perverse sexual world. For the aristocracy, marriage was political strategy. For the poor, no privacy existed. But they all were subject to the same regime of terror and disinformation. Behind every ritual, every sadistic regulation, stood real human beings. Shivering young brides, desperate lovers, and individuals caught in a maze of spiritual damnation and social convention. Their existence is more valuable than shock. It's more valuable to recall, because they show us how far we have traveled and why we must protect our rights to knowledge and love. For in the Middle Ages, even knowledge of your own body was threatening. Early physicians and church officials protected sex information as tightly as sacred scripture. What little existed was drenched in myth, misogyny, and terror. The result? A world where no one actually knew the body, but everybody feared it. And that is where we begin, on an adventure into a world that feels distant but weirdly familiar. At a time when misinformation spreads like wildfire on the internet in a matter of seconds, and the right to own one's body is still debated, history is teaching us an eerie lesson. What is the outcome when medicine is controlled by superstition? When nature turns bad? When the human body is no longer yours? The answers are in the cold stone walls and smoky huts of medieval Europe, where love and fear danced a killing waltz. The ignorance about female anatomy in the medieval period led to not only misinformation but also tragedy. Women were stigmatized, even punished, for not bleeding on their wedding night, accused of fornication or unchastity regardless of the truth. Victims of rape were spurned simply because their hymens were already damaged, and some resorted to outright falsehoods. Hidden pockets of animal blood sewn into sheets, all in an effort to legitimize something biology never guaranteed. The notorious examination of chastity was as much a ritualized act of violence as it was an attempt to discover the truth. Midwives, alone often among women permitted to examine female bodies, were tasked with intrusive exams, conducted with filthy instruments and scant knowledge. Alas, these gruff exams often caused the very damage they were meant to detect. A woman's future, her marriage, her reputation, her life, may have depended upon these painful and erroneous procedures. The cult of virginity was not just publicly expressed as shame. It created a profitable black market. Women and their families who were desperate tried surreptitious techniques, astringent herbal remedies to clench muscles, secret animal bladders full of blood, and even failed surgeries to reconstruct the hymen. These things were not lies. They were survival in a world where a woman's worth was measured by whether she was or was not thought to be pure. Medieval texts do mention these deceptions sometimes, but always as cautionary tales for men, never as a recognition of the intolerable burden on women. The century's medical theories about sexuality were more like twisted fairy tales than science. One of the most popular ideas was the wandering womb theory, an old theory that held that the female uterus was a wandering organ that would move around her body unless it was kept satisfied with sex at all times. Its symptoms? Hysteria, shortness of breath. The remedy? Frequent intercourse to pin down the womb. And even though medieval doctors did recognize women may feel sexual pleasure, that acknowledgement was two-edged. They opined that both must orgasm to get pregnant, a belief that sounds oddly modern until you see the horrific ramifications. If a woman got pregnant after rape, officials claimed it proved she must have been getting enjoyment out of the assault, erasing her trauma and keeping her from getting justice. Myths went on and on. Menstruation was disgustingly and fearfully considered. Menstrual blood was thought to ruin crops, turn wine sour, blacken mirrors, and even infect children born to a woman while she was menstruating. These were not just articulated by villagers. These were written in medical texts and doctrine in churches. Women were forbidden from kitchens, churches, and even contact with loved ones while they were menstruating, banned to pariahs for a normal bodily function. Male sexuality, nevertheless equally misunderstood, was not subjected nearly so cruelly. Medieval doctors believed semen was refined blood, created in the brain and stored in the testicles. They chastised intense sex or masturbation as a means of weakness, blindness, or madness, but at the same time, they believed moderate sex vital to men's health. There was an apparent double standard. While women's lust was dangerous, men's was medicinal. Impotency treatments were understandably ridiculous. Everything from powdered-up rhino horn to much more gruesome, rubbing burning nettle against the genitals. Contraception and abortion cowered in the shadows. Passed around in whispers, herbal contraceptives like pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, and tansy were secretly employed. Some did work, others were deadly, toxicity causing liver failure, bleeding, and death. The church anathematized all birth control, but poverty had turned it into a practical convenience for so many. Midwives who provided such cures had to tread the narrow tightrope between healer and heretic. Where sexually transmitted disease was concerned, medieval medicine transitioned from ignorance to outright sadistic. Syphilis, or the Great Pox, was cured with mercury, poison that would decay teeth, brains out of sorts, and bodies to mush. When treating gonorrhea, doctors used metal rods pushed into the urethra or scorching materials applied to open sores. These agonizing cures were often translated as God's revenge, a mix of religious remorse and fleshy agony. Perhaps nowhere was this agony more evident than during childbirth. Without any understanding of infection and hygiene, doctors and midwives performed invasive examinations with filthy hands, spreading deadly childbed fever that killed dozens of mothers. Troublesome deliveries were met with brutal tools. Hooks to pull out dead infants or crude cesarean sections without anesthesia, almost invariably killing the mother. Rather than letting nature take its course, the medieval motto seemed to be, better a violent intervention than no intervention. The church added to the confusion, constructing a complex system of sexual regulations that were nearly unachievable. Sex was forbidden on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. In Lent, Advent, Easter week, and Whitsun week. On saints, martyrs, and virgins' days. And during menstruation, pregnancy, and lactation. When it was all added up, married couples had less than 50 acceptable days a year to have intercourse. The objective wasn't to stop intimacy, it was to make every act be accompanied by guilt, then confession. Even sexual positions were in question. Only the missionary position was acceptable, since it was representative of proper male dominance. Woman on top, standing, or rear entry were perversions, acts so sinful that they were said to invite the influence of the devil. Penalties were severe. Confession guides instructed priests to sentence these sins to years of fasting, bread and water alone. More sinister, confession became an instrument of spying. Priests became adept at asking private, graphic questions about sex. They weren't open-ended questions, they were a script, asking if women had used male genital-shaped devices or performed specific acts of pleasure. The confessional was no longer a sacrament of forgiveness. It was now an inquisition chamber, where spiritual authority was combined with an erotic need to dominate. And under this corrupted system of morality, there came another gross notion, the conjugal debt. Church doctrine taught that each spouse owed the other sex at will. Withholding from your husband or wife wasn't just selfish. It was sinful. Under this clause, a rejected spouse could forgive adultery or end the marriage. The church's teaching on sex created lose-lose scenarios, particularly for women. A wife could be worn out from childbearing, in discomfort from previous pregnancies, or simply uninterested in sex, but still required to perform what was termed her conjugal duty. Meanwhile, the church preached restraint, stating lust, even in marriage, was dangerous. Couples were forced to figure out an impossible ethical puzzle, being trapped between the threat of sin and the remorse of refusal. Sanctions for sexual misbehavior varied wildly, depending on class, gender, and politics in the immediate vicinity. A noble found in adultery would receive a small fine or light penance. A peasant woman found similarly would be beaten, stripped, and led through the streets in shame. Homosexuality, called sodomy and associated with heresy, was punished with sadistic cruelty. Castration, imprisonment, even being burned at the stake. But enforcement was random. Some regions barely enforced these laws, while others launched brutal purges. Nowhere was hypocrisy more glaring than among the church's own clergy. While priests were ordained celibate, many openly maintained mistresses. In some dioceses, this had become so rampant that priests simply were taxed for it. Children born of the affair, referred to as priests' bastards, lived in a strange limbo, legally illegitimate, yet often supported and educated by their fathers. While these same priests preached chastity, they also asked questions about the sex lives of their flock. Perhaps the most tragic victim of medieval control over sex was its effect on victims of sexual violence. The raped woman was greeted with not sympathy, but questioning. She was blamed for what she wore, her past, and her purity. If anyone did accept her, a rare phenomenon, the spotlight went not on her violation, but on the damage done to the reputation or property of her family. The church's radical focus on chastity in women and men's supremacy created an environment of silence, where abusers thrived and victims stayed quiet for fear of shame. Even among the nobility, where one might have thought that money and power had given a little cover, the sexual demands were no less oppressive. Marriages to royalty were not love matches, political marriages with consummation as the official seal. Wedding nights were sometimes half-public affairs, with officials brought in to witness that the union had been physically consummated. The inability to consummate was enough to invalidate a marriage, threatening peace treaties and igniting war. The age at which noble women were married shocks modern sensibilities. Margaret Beaufort, for example, bore future King Henry VII when she was 13 years old. She was so weakened in health that she never bore another child. Childbearing age brides were not rare, sent to faraway courts as pieces in struggles for power and expected to produce heirs before they were emotionally and physically prepared. The cost was exacted in trauma, pain, and mortality. Noble women were in the spotlight. Ladies-in-waiting had menstrual cycles in accordance with political itineraries, and they reported irregularities to worried fathers or husbands. Rumors alone would cause scandals, as happened to Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose supposed lovers provided subject for gossip in Europe. Noblemen openly indulged in adultery. Their bastard children often inherited titles, land, and recognition. Their mothers, however seduced or forced, were forever stained by shame. Dynastic marriages produced more than just alliances. They generated genetic disasters. The fabled Habsburg jaw, inherited hemophilia, and unhealthful heirs generation after generation were all side effects of medieval nobility's continued inbreeding. But instead of accusing this circumscribed gene pool, the blame rested, as it often did, on the woman. A queen who had failed to produce a healthy heir was often replaced by one younger and more fertile. Royal courts developed elaborate rituals surrounding pregnancy and childbirth. Queens and duchesses had public inspections to confirm pregnancies. They delivered in public with courtiers present, and babies were checked immediately for sex and health. The stakes were too high to leave anything to chance or to discretion. Royal physicians, more astrologer than medical man, prescribed absurd fertility remedies. Bathing in virgin's blood, eating powdered gems, or copulating with the stars. Sex education for the sons and daughters of the nobility was ridiculously askew. Boys learned about sex from prostitutes or servants, occasionally from their fathers as initiation. Girls were left in the dark. Their reputation was precious, and knowledge was deadly. So many wedding nights introduced the naive, frightened girls to boys educated to view sex as conquest, not relationship. Courtly love, sung in verse and song, added yet another twist. Knights vowed chastity to wedded women, risking life and limb to obey them. Though ostensibly chaste, the affair was ambiguous on the difference between love and lust. Medieval literature was abounding with stolen kisses, furtive trysts, and swooning professions. These were usually excusing adultery in the name of true love. Appearance preceded reality. A noblewoman may have been a heroine of romantic virtue while maintaining a skein of real or imaginary affairs. At the bottom, in the villages, it was no easier, just more exposed. For peasants, privacy was virtually impossible. Whole households lived in single-room dwellings, often with livestock. There were no bedrooms. Sexual intimacy took place within earshot or eyesight of parents, children, and animals. Those wishing to be alone would steal into forests or fields, vulnerable to discovery as well as danger. However, the peasant class did develop some of its own customs regarding love and intimacy. One of these was bundling, in which the couple courting slept together in the same bed but dressed, sometimes with a board of wood between them. Everyone was in on the performance. The board could be rocked out, clothes be moved. But if appearances were maintained on the surface, a couple's honor was still technically sound. Even in the strictest societies, human urge somehow prevails, and in medieval peasant society, it took the form of establishing a balance between natural desire and community demands. Folk traditions, particularly surrounding fertility and sexuality, thrived in subtle defiance of church teaching. Country May Day celebrations, for example, were rich in ritual and occasionally in explicit sex. Maypole dances simulating intercourse, fertility dances in newly turned fields, and transient relaxing of the usual sexual strictures. These rituals were viewed with horror by the church, but the people went on to keep them about them, intuitively understanding that well-ripened crops and healthy children mattered more than ideological moralities. Peasant women, often denied access to formal education, established their own hidden networks for the exchange of sexual information. Herbal birth control, abortion potions, and cures for sexual ailments were passed secretly from mother to daughter, midwife to bride. The knowledge was in full view, camouflaged in nursery rhymes, lullabies, and songs. A ballad about picking herbs by moonlight might really be a hidden guide to making contraceptive pessaries. To most women, these underground customs were the entire extent of sex education they would ever receive. Economic necessity governed sexual life as much as clerical pressure. Children meant more workers and more mouths to feed. Contraception, in the lack of effective methods, was a question of timing and self-control. Couples would practice abstinence during times of scarcity because another child would push them into starvation. Peasant women tracked their cycles, not for piety but pure survival, using the primitive rhythm method to avoid pregnancies they couldn't afford. Sexual assault in peasant society was widespread and rarely punished. The rape of a peasant woman by a local lord wasn't even technically a rape. It was rather the unauthorized use of his property. Women tended to be met with disbelief and shame when they did report attacks. Consent is something that we consider today to be valid only if it is unforced. Medieval society didn't view it quite this way. Economic necessity provided muddled situations, where a woman would agree to sex merely because the man owned her family house or means of support. Not quite under compulsion, but even among these tight-knit communities, there were some forms of bottom-up justice. One such response was chivalry, public shaming rituals that used noise, ridicule song, and sometimes violence to chasten violators of sexual community norms. An older man who married a much younger woman, a husband-beating spouse, or an acknowledged predator could find himself the target of such anarchic, cathartic expression. These weren't punishments sanctioned by the state, but they registered the community's own norm and refusal to be silenced. The official law code, however, was far less sympathetic. Medieval rape statutes did not aim to protect women, they aimed to protect male ownership. Rape was legally defined as damage done to a woman's guardian's property, and not as an assault upon her person. That underlying misconception shaped every step of the system of justice. The level of proof allocated to victims was extremely high. To be believed, a woman had to prove she screamed loudly throughout the attack, struggled physically to the point of injury, and made a complaint immediately. Delay, silence, or lack of wounds was taken as evidence of consent. Literally, the law wanted women to put their lives on the line, struggling back just to be worthy of the promise of justice. If the case amounted to nothing, as it most often did, the accuser was brutally punished. A woman who accused a man of rape but could not prove it may face the same punishment as her assailant. Public flogging, ruinously expensive fines, even death. The law's message was clear. Silence was more desirable than truth. The law became only uglier when it addressed itself to rape pregnancies. A commonly held, sadly widespread myth was that conception is not possible without female orgasm. So if a rape victim became pregnant, the pregnancy was used as proof that she had enjoyed the experience. Women in this situation were compelled to face an impossible choice. Risk death from a dangerous abortion or bear the child and be labeled a liar or worse. Others, eager to excuse themselves, blamed supernatural assault, invoking demons or spirits to explain their condition and yet preserve a facade of social innocence. Adultery laws appeared to reflect the extreme gender imbalance of medieval life. A wife's adultery was a felony, punishable by whipping, public humiliation, imprisonment, or death. Yet men's adultery was only criminal if they slept with another man's wife. Sleeping with an unmarried woman? No issue. Unless the woman was a nobleman's daughter or property belonging to another man, the act pretty much went unpunished. The management of prostitution was another practice of contradiction. Brothels were often legally accepted, regulated, and taxed. Municipal governments viewed them as necessary evils in order to protect respectable women from uncontrolled male desire. Prostitutes had to dress in special clothing or badges, live in special districts, and be regularly inspected. But the same authorities who had granted them licenses would sometimes stage moral sweeps, shutting down brothels and arresting the very women they'd been profiting from. These were women who existed in a world where exploitation was constant and escape nearly impossible. Sex became even more sinister when it crossed religious boundaries. Sex between Jews and Christians was forbidden in much of Europe, with punishments severe. A Christian so ensnared would endanger confession and penance. The Jewish one would be murdered. These laws were not just about religious segregation, they were about preserving social hierarchies through sexual regulation. This was the case with prohibitions between Christians and Muslims in Iberian territories, making love, or even sex with consent, a death penalty. And in the last centuries of the Middle Ages, sexual repression reappeared in a new form: the witch craze. Accusations of witchcraft were brought against women who broke sexual norms. Midwives, herbalists, widows who did not retract from sex, or simply garrulous women who would not be mastered by men were easy targets. What they knew about bodies, fertility, or medicine was converted into evil. What began in the form of church discussion about sin had now developed into a deadly hysteria, one that would erupt into bloodshed during the early modern witch hunts. Medieval witchcraft accusations were seldom just about magic. They were closely entangled with sex, gender, and power. Would-be witches were accused of sex with demons, rendering men impotent, or even stealing penises and keeping them as bizarre, animate pets, giving them oats and hay to eat. These fantastical allegations, taken from books like the Malleus Maleficarum, were not a product of simple superstition. They expressed deep male fear of female sexual autonomy. Investigations of witchcraft were often nothing more than sanctioned sexual violence. Women suspected of witchcraft were stripped, shaved, and searched, scrutinized for devil's marks, or anesthetized patches on the skin that were supposed to verify demoniac contact. These brutal examinations were billed as legal procedures, yet were actually a form of sexual torture, humiliating and degrading, intended to break women in body and spirit. Knowledge was behind most accusations. Knowledge of the female body specifically. Women who understood how to prevent themselves from becoming pregnant, facilitate the birth, or enhance the pleasures of sex were walking on thin ice. That knowledge so easily turned against them made them strong, and that strength exposed them. Midwives especially had a dangerous position, respected when everything went fine, yet instantly culpable when birth failed. A stillbirth or difficult delivery could make a good healer into a witch overnight. The social boundaries were wafer thin. A woman who spurned the advances of a man could be blamed for his new illness. One who caught too much eye with her appearance would be suspected of using magic to attract. An older woman who dared to have a vibrant sex life post-menopause was reported to have made a pact with the devil so that she could keep herself youthful. Sexuality and sexual control became equivalent to witchcraft in the minds of frightened, patriarchal communities. The methods used to extract confessions were royally despicable. Torture devices like the infamous witch's chair, which had spikes that were meant to harm genitals, exposed the sexualized sadism that lay behind the trials. Women were turned into public spectacles, naked, exposed, violated, all in the name of eliminating evil. And the damage did not stop there with the suspects. Societies that allowed witch hunts often descended into sexual hysteria. Husbands accused their wives. Neighbors accused each other's bedrooms. Adolescent girls were bullied into naming older women their sexual initiators. And personal failures, impotence, miscarriage, infertility, were blamed on hexes and spells. The witch trials criminalized domestic failures as public sins. They armed fear, shame, and guilt, and targeted women most of all. But the history of this madness did not end with the last hanging. These histories provided a model for centuries of repression. They instructed societies in how to sexualize women's power, how to discipline female knowledge, and how to translate male insecurity into institutional violence. The figure of the witch, seductive, deadly, uncontrollable, remains in our culture. And so much of what was demonized as witchcraft was really merely women's understanding of their own bodies. A remedy to calm cramps became evidence of meeting with devils. A birth control herb became called black magic. These witch hunts criminalized women's efforts at controlling their own reproduction, a struggle that continues under other names to this day. As we finish this unsettling journey through medieval sexuality, one fact is unavoidable. Across all classes, locations, and identities, people's most private lives were under constant domination. From noble brides forced into public consummation to peasant women murdered by risky abortions, the common thread was an ugly fantasy, that sexuality could, and ought to, be controlled from outside. And even though we can gaze back in outrage, we must confess that there are still echoes of all that now. Virgin tests continue to be administered. Contraception and abortion continue to be fought about in most places. Rape victims continue to be questioned, blamed, and re-traumatized by the courts. Medical centers continue to invalidate women's pain, describing it as hysteria in new forms. And don't forget, the very same medieval laws that ordained acceptable sexual acts have simply developed into modern-day persecution of LGBTQ+ people. What was once enforced by courts is now echoed in legislation, policies, and bias. The intersections were, and still are, inescapable. Your rank may determine whether your wedding night was a private affair or one for public display. Your religion may sentence love freely given to death. Your gender may determine whether your wisdom was listened to or feared. What preserved many medieval individuals from complete subjugation wasn't power, it was the unenforceability of every rule. Distance, disobedience, and the complexity of human nature created gaps within the system. Individuals made room for each other in those gaps. They whispered, they sang, they transmitted information clandestinely. They survived. The stories we've been talking about, of frightened young brides, of rebellious women swapping contraceptive tips, of tortured midwives and gagged lovers, also remind us that history is not just about wars and monarchs. It's about bodies, about sex, about the pain of being controlled, and the courage it takes to resist. And yet, as we can be thankful for the progress we've made, this journey is hardly over. The path from demon lovers and loose wombs to defective medical knowledge and restricted sexual freedom is a long one. And we are still on it. The Middle Ages are at once a distant past and a reflection. Let it serve as a warning. When fear outvotes empathy, when power outvies consent, when ignorance outdoes truth, no one is really free. In coming to know their shadow, maybe, just maybe, we can protect our own light.